Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first panel, which is all about putting patients at the heart of drug development. Well, this is a topic that's very close to my heart, but also a very fitting way to start the Galien Forum, which is all about innovation. And the important thing about innovation is when it reaches patients and delivers health outcomes. So, of course, starting with the patient is a great way to start this panel. My name is Mel Walker, as Muniz said. I'm an advisor to life sciences and digital health companies. But what's not on my bio is actually the most important job that I picked up recently, and that is being a dad. And fairly recently, it's 4 or 5 years ago. But I was speaking to I have a little boy who's Arlo, and he's 4.5 years old. I have a daughter who's just coming up for 6 months. So if I seem a little tired, she was up in the night. I'm still coping with those times. But I spoke to Arlo this morning about that I was going to talk about being a parent. And he said to me, "Dad, why don't you ask the audience to raise their hands if they're a parent?" And I'm regularly sort of blown away by some of the things that he suggested. But I said, I will do that, Arlo. So I'm going to ask you, can you raise your hands if you are a parent? Okay, so fantastic. So I can let him know that I did that. So thanks for indulging me. But then you will understand that when you become a parent for the first time, lots of things change in many wonderful ways. But sometimes things surprise you that you sort of weren't really expecting. And one of the things that surprised me the most was actually my attitude to risk. So I'm a bit of a risk taker. So I've done bungee jumps, parachute jumps. I even learnt to paraglide, which is, maybe it's considered quite a dangerous sport. But I was sort of always found it quite strange how my parents showed all this excessive worry about me doing these things. I thought, this is just too much. And then, of course, I became a parent. And then my whole perspective changed, because the idea of even my son getting on a motorbike in the future kind of fills me with anxiety and worry. So I think it's interesting. So really your attitude to risk changes. And then we had, myself and my partner Laura, we had a decision to make last year. It was a minor decision about a procedure for Arlo. It's a tonsillectomy. Now, I had my tonsils removed when I was 3. If someone said to me that before I became a parent, they said, "Oh, my son's got to have his tonsils out," I'm saying, "What's the problem? No worries. It's a routine, low-risk procedure." But when it came to this decision, we were given the decision to make, and we were told that actually that Arlo could grow out of it in 2 or 3 years and could be fine, or he might not. So we had to make this decision, and even though I knew the risks were tiny, somehow those risks became much larger in our minds, and it became quite a tough decision to make. Anyway, we decided to go ahead and have the operation, and it was a success, and all of his symptoms are resolved. We're very happy we did it. But I think what that sort of brings to light, which is particularly relevant for today, is how we view benefit and risk. So if even an individual can view benefit and risk differently for themselves or for someone else that they're advocating for, it's not surprising that these things can be different for patients, between patients in the same group, between different patients, and certainly between patients, drug developers, and regulators, which I think is a sort of great segue into the sort of panel and why this is such an important topic. We have to engage patients, and we have to understand what they want and what they need without assuming that we know this. So with that, I'd really like to welcome our panelists. Maybe perhaps we could take a seat on the stage. I'm really delighted. We've got such a fantastic panel of leaders in this space joining us here today, and particularly appreciate the fact that you've travelled from mainland Europe, but also from the US to be with us here today on this really important topic. So thank you very much for coming. Maybe we can just start with some introductions. If you could give your name, your organisation, and then any disclaimers you want to give about the perspective you're sharing today. Maybe we'll start with Robyn and go this way, please.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Robyn Bent. I'm the Director of Patient-Focused Drug Development in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the US FDA. I'm really pleased to be here with you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Gheuens. I'm the Chief Medical Officer and Head of R&D at Agios Pharmaceuticals, so I'll be bringing the industry perspective to this panel today. Very happy to be here.
Hi, My name is Elisabeth Vroom. I'm the chair of the World Duchenne Organization and the mother of a 33-year-old man with Duchenne, so I do have some experience in patient life, but I also am involved in activities where patients are involved at the EMA and have done several other activities in the field of the role of patient and patient organization in drug development.
So that leads very nicely. I'm Maria Mavris. I'm patient liaison at the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and I've worked with Elizabeth and also Robyn for several years, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to kick off with a question to the regulators on our panel, first of all. So perhaps Robyn and Maria, you could tell us a bit about how have the regulatory processes evolved in terms of patient engagement? What are the sort of key developments that you'd like sort of life sciences to be aware of? And then critically, how do you feel that patient voice is really influencing regulatory decision making?
I'm happy to start, thank you. So the EMA hasn't existed as long as the FDA, but we'll be celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. From the very beginning, patients came to the European Medicines Agency and knocked on the door. I think this is a big difference between patients and our other stakeholders, that the patients very much recognize the value of working with the regulators. So there's always been a bit of a give and take. There's been more of an ongoing process of learning from interacting with the patients. So we have this timeline of the regulatory development process, and we show where patients are involved throughout the regulatory pathway of a medicine. And it's everywhere, but it didn't happen just like that overnight. It really happened with time and with engagement with patients and listening to what they wanted and trying different things. And so, you know, from the early days when the people living with HIV came and said they wanted to speak to us, obviously post FDA as well, and then from the time where they wanted to put thalidomide back on the market, and the thalidomide victims met with the multiple myeloma patients and had a very nice discussion, and the regulators were very nervous during that discussion. It was really early on. But now, you know, my day-to-day is just constantly all of my colleagues during different regulatory processes are always asking me for patients. We won't, a meeting without a patient, it's a big question mark. Why is there no patient here? So the evolution over that time has been quite significant. What is the impact now? Impact is always a really difficult thing to measure, and I think it depends very much on what the activity is. So last year, or the year before, we published a paper on the impact and added value of the patient voice in scientific advice procedures. So scientific advice is something that's not compulsory for companies to request from a medicines agency and not compulsory for them to follow the advice given. But we systematically involve patients, and of course, it started with rare disease patients, and we showed that the impact of the patient voice also impacted the advice that was given to companies in 20% of the cases, and also that the patients did agree with the advice, with the development plan of the company. So we can see that there's a lot of understanding of the process, but it's also training is needed as well. So I'll hand over to Robyn.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So as Maria mentioned, patient engagement with FDA has been going on for a really long time, but patient-focused drug development really started in around 2012 with the idea that we would hold these patient-focused drug development meetings focused on hearing from patients with a specific condition as a way of informing FDA's benefit risk assessments. But what we really learned from that, and I say we, and I mean it in a global sense, is that in general we were kind of missing the mark as far as sometimes the endpoints that were being measured in clinical trials weren't endpoints that mattered to patients. Sometimes clinical trial designs were overly burdensome and kept patients from being able to actively participate or be retained in studies and things like that. And so we really learned that hearing what matters to patients at the end, at the time of a regulatory decision, is really a missed opportunity to hear from them throughout, where you can actually impact the drug development planning and the drug development implementation. And so patient-focused drug development has kind of evolved. We're still doing the PFDD meetings, and I think they're critically important, but we're trying to encourage people to move them to earlier in the drug development process, as well as to incorporate the patient perspective throughout the process, as opposed to just thinking about it as something to turn into regulators at the very end, because that's really just a massively missed opportunity.
Thank you, Robyn. So Sarah, I'd like to turn to you next and sort of think about when you're seeing the sort of regulators sort of developing their thinking around patient engagement. Obviously, that then catalyses a shift in how the industry works. Could you share with me sort of how, and with the audience, how you sort of feel about how those developments are impacting on industry, and also where you think we are today in terms of patient engagement, and then maybe sort of finish off on how do you feel the patient is really influencing R&D decisions?
Sure. It's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
So I think I'm going to pick up where Robyn was talking about. So I work for a company where we have a slogan, fueled by connections. And this really means that we're trying to engage with all different stakeholders that are important for drug development. And of course, the most important stakeholder, no offense to the regulators, or, are the patients. And I think this is something that we have uniquely done by bringing patient advisory boards forward very early in drug development, so we can actually do exactly what Robyn was highlighting, understand where the endpoints are or understand the endpoints that patients truly care about, and also understand the logistics of a clinical trial, because sometimes we're trying to answer scientific questions that may or may not be relevant to patients. So if it's not, then why are we even trying to explore this in the clinical trial? Or we're trying to do things that we think may be burdensome, but then when you actually talk to caregivers or patients, they actually have a completely opposite view. So within our clinical trial development, I can say that there is a program in which there is an endpoint that we need to have for the regulators. But when we speak to patients, they actually care very much about another endpoint. So by learning that, we actually were able to incorporate additional endpoints in our trial so we can deliver a more broad spectrum of information that we know patients will truly care about. And then another thing, and this is something where we can never really be in a patient's position because we don't have the disease. I'll speak for myself, I had a notion that something was going to be very burdensome in a clinical trial, an MRI of the liver. And when we were actually talking to the caregivers, they were like, no, we actually want you to incorporate that in a clinical trial, because otherwise we will have to do this anyways for our clinical care. It will add another visit on top of our clinical trial visits, and so it becomes more burdensome if you don't incorporate it in the clinical trial. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, an MRI for children, they have to get anesthesia and all of this. It's going to be way too hard and more challenging. I would never have learned that piece of information if we would not have engaged with patients and caregivers. And so I think from an industry perspective, actually listening to patients early on, not at the end of the clinical development, allows you to design clinical trials that will deliver data for the multiple stakeholders that are involved in drug development, but also make the logistics of the trial actually work better, because ultimately if you can't run the clinical trial and can't deliver on the end and can't provide the clinical information because it was too burdensome or too difficult, then you serve nobody. So that's where I think the industry really needs to be very thoughtful, very early on.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Elizabeth, I know you're passionate about influencing drug development and you're representing the patient voice here. Yeah. So how are patient organisations, how are they responding to the fact this field is evolving? And then also, how do you feel that they're really sort of influencing and impacting on drug development, whether that's by impacting companies or by impacting the regulators?
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm for a while in this field, and I always have been surprised. I mean, I love what you said. I fully agree. That's clear. But she's an exception. Let's be clear about that as well. And but meanwhile, in this 33 years, my son with Duchenne became an industrial designer, an engineer. And the first lesson they learn is, before you design a product, a technical product, you start with the people who are going to use it. Well, I can tell you, in drug development, we're far behind in that. So I was always ashamed to hear these 18, 19-year-old kids speaking about this around the kitchen table and think, where are we in drug development? And then I think also, and it's in line with what you say, sorry, we kind of already, that there are a few things you have to realize. People are in drug development for a certain incentive, right? So companies have to please their shareholders. That is fine, but it is also fine if you're just open about that, not saying, oh, I'm here for the patient, I love you so much and I do it for you. It might be, and there's very nice people here and there, that's something else. But as a system, the incentive is money. And for the patient, and that leads sometimes to things that you really want to discuss, what is the incentive for a patient. But also there are clinicians and researchers who have their own agenda. So for that, multi-stakeholder meetings are relevant, but also just to be honest. You know, there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to lie about. So that helps. And what we did is a few things. So you spoke about risk. That is definitely something. I mean, and I try to tell some personal stories here because otherwise I'm just another talking head. But recently a little child died in a gene therapy trial for Duchenne. 2 weeks ago, a 3-year-old boy. And then the friends of my son were so upset, and he said, imagine he could have had such a good life as just as my son had. So, you know, where everybody thinks like, oh, living with that disease is terrible, but dying because of a drug is worse, you know. So the risk is an important thing, I think, in all discussions, and the benefit. And then you also said, what can you do as patients? Well, the first time, and Maria knows this story, sorry, Maria, I met a regulator. She was Dutch and blunt, like I'm also Dutch. She gave me a hand and said, are you from the patient? Drugs are approved on data, not on emotions. So, and then I realized that if the language of regulators is data, then we as patients have to provide data. So if we want to get if that's the language they speak, fine. So if we want to get our points across, we have to collect data. So in Duchenne, that's what we did. We always can do better, eh? So it's not that we are the perfect team. But for example, on one of the questions in Duchenne was always about the burden of muscle biopsies. How many muscle biopsies can you do? What is acceptable? And so on. And then traditional, also because like the ethics committee, for example, in the Netherlands said, you know, you only can do a biopsy in the phase 3 trial because they call that a therapeutic trial, which is a therapeutic misconception in itself. But anyway, so in the phase 3 you could do it, but not earlier. And then we went back to families from Netherlands, Italy, UK, who had their children in trials with biopsies. And the outcome was, why do biopsies in phase 3? So there were kids in the placebo group who had 5 biopsies. So muscle are, you know, you want to save every fiber, and then you do 5 biopsies in a placebo. So they said, no, not in a placebo. If you want to do it early, just to show in a small group kind of proof of principle that indeed the protein is produced, fine. But if you do it later in the phase 3 and in placebo group, we think that's unethical. And within the EMA now, this whole discussion has changed, and this is what we discuss. And another was that trials were only done in ambulant population. That's only a quarter of the Duchenne boys. So then we were as naive as thinking like, okay, if they want to do a trial in the ambulant, and they is not the EMA, they are the companies. And then we will, through extrapolation, also have indications for the non-ambulant. That's not what happened. And then we asked, but why are you not doing trials in non-ambulant patients? And say, oh, because we don't have a good outcome measure. And we thought, oh my God, if that is the reason why the majority of the Duchenne patients won't have access to drug because they don't do trials in non-ambulant patients, because they don't have outcome measures, then we develop an outcome measure. So that's what we did, and we really, and I think that is something we will here all say, started with the patient. So we interviewed boys with Duchenne and asked them, who were already wheelchair bound, what would be the most important for you? And they said, do we have a guess here in the room? What did they say? The boys who were non-ambulant in Duchenne, what they hoped the drug would do for them. Being able to put their hands on the table. Because then you can still eat yourself, use your laptop. Because if you Walking is highly overrated, and that's one of the quotes of the boys themselves. So it's really the use of your arm function. So we developed, as patient organization, we funded that, and we got outcome measures for non-ambulant patients. So yeah, there are a few things you can do, and there's much more. But
well, thank you, Elizabeth. So it's interesting. I like the comment that you made about sort of regulators saying we make decisions on data, not emotions. And I did my PhD in developing a patient-reported outcome measure, so I know that there's a hard science and methodology, most of which I've forgotten now. But you know, the fact is there is this view, I think, in the industry that sort of patient engagement is a bit fluffy, and it's sort of, you know, and I wonder whether we can sort of maybe get sort of overcome that a bit. You've already raised some quite concrete examples, which is great. Maybe we can sort of, to the rest of the panel, can you really think of super concrete, tangible examples where patient voice has really impacted on something the drug developer has done or the regulators have done and made a significant change to an outcome? I loved your, I'm sure you've got other examples, Elizabeth, but maybe we can ask for some examples from the rest of the panel. Do you want to start, Sarah?
Sure. One example for me that comes to mind is an outcome. It's actually fatigue. We are developing a drug for sickle cell disease, and one of the clinical endpoints is sickle cell pain crisis reduction, which is because it's so visible and it can lead to patients dying when they have a crisis. It's considered a clinically meaningful endpoint, and it hits on the field function and or survival. Now, when we went to talk to patients, they actually highlighted that fatigue for them is equally, or if not more important, as one of the outcomes measured, which was an eye-opener because, you know, from a physician's perspective, you can see this one event leading to hospitalization and all of these bad outcomes. But the way they were looking at it, when I go in for a sickle cell pain crisis, I can get pain therapies and it's bad, but I will be taken care of. The fatigue, however, I live with on a daily basis. I cannot, you know, express how horrible this is, and it's not like I'm just a little bit tired because my child kept me awake. This is like stop in your tracks fatigue. And the thing that they were mentioning on the emotion component is that fatigue actually prevents them from doing things in their work life, but it also makes them feel super guilty towards their family and caregivers, because this is like an added burden, like from their perspective, to the caregivers. Those are things that we would not have thought of as classic drug developers. And so this did lead to an incorporation of trying to measure fatigue via a patient-reported outcome as a secondary endpoint, to provide further evidence that we can impact that with this specific drug that we're testing in development. So I think that's where there is an added benefit to actually, indeed, like your example is perfect, right? Because when you talk to patients, they will highlight different things that we would never otherwise think of as being more critical.
Yeah, well, thank you. Robyn and then Maria.
Actually, can I ask just a quick follow-up question? Because following our prep call, I went back and I looked at our patient-focused drug development meeting on sickle cell, and we saw that people talked about the pain crisis, the fatigue, and then cognition.
Yes.
Did you hear about cognition as well?
So actually,
I mean, that's really hard to measure. But
it is. We actually asked, because sickle cell disease leads to a lot of organ damage, both because of the pain crisis and the infarcts associated with it, but also because of chronic hemolysis and inflammation. And so we did ask about different organs. Kidney came up as number one, followed by brain. Okay. And but brain is tough because it's tied into that fatigue and a brain fog, but also tied into stroke, and so it's a tough one. We are actually, based on that advice, embarking on another study for renal disease. To try to provide evidence there. That is not one like a pivotal study that we say, but trying to provide more evidence on the potential beneficial effects based on that patient input.
There's a real theme of sort of focusing on the whole patient, isn't there, rather than just sort of this sort of specific aspect of the disease that you're measuring.
Right. So, and I think that what this conversation really highlights is that there are things that matter to patients that can be measured in a clinical trial, and there are things that might change during the duration of a clinical trial, but unfortunately, not everything that matters to patients is something that we know how to measure well or expect is going to change over the duration of a trial. So I think that it's important to kind of think about that, and really, when choices are made, really communicate that back to the patients with maybe some of the rationale as well, so that it doesn't feel like, and I know you have, but like.
No, I totally agree with that, because I think you're highlighting something very important, I think, for all stakeholders, right? This is for physician advisory boards that we do, for patient advisory boards. When you get input and then you go engage with another stakeholder and you get other input, ultimately drug development is about trying to incorporate as many different viewpoints into one clinical trial that will deliver to to its best of its possibilities. That means that sometimes you can't do certain things, and we have heard certain feedback around patients saying, well, we don't want to do placebo. That is not going to fly, right? Like in certain drug development, you do need a placebo group. And that was feedback we heard from both regulators that we engaged with at that time point. So we went back to the patients to explain why, and we had already done why placebo needed to happen, but that a certain time frame was needed. Went back to explain why we needed that time frame and why placebo was needed, and then we also tried to explain the mitigation measures we had put into place, like a 2-to-1 randomization, a long open label extension that can really continue to provide drug to all patients participating as like a mitigation in a way for the placebo participation. Yeah. And I think it's important, like if you can't do something for certain reasons, you need to explain why you can't do certain.
Yeah, good patient information, education is key, isn't it? But can I come back to this concrete example?
Yes, really I'm not trying to avoid the question.
where it really has impacted on a decision that the FDA has made, and then I'll come to
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's impacted on decisions that FDA has made, and I'll give you examples. I will get to it, I swear, and I'll do it quickly. But I think what's really important is that it has also, this information from patients also impacts advice that FDA gives throughout the drug development process, including kind of, the end of phase 1 meetings, the end of phase 2 meetings, and things like that, where we understand from patients what matters to them, and we encourage companies to kind of go and talk to patients to ensure that they understand what matters to patients. And so but as a concrete example of something where it has impacted kind of FDA's advice and regulatory decision making. So there's certainly an example in progressive familial intrahepatic, oh God.
Easy for
cholestasis. Sorry. I need to pick an example that's like very simple. I know, exactly. Where we really did hear directly from patients that itch was a really, really critical factor for them, that it was really disruptive to their lives, and that the current treatments, off-label and others that were available to them, were not meeting their needs, and so there was a significant unmet need for this. And so the endpoint of itch was actually accepted based on these discussions with patients, really kind of understanding the impact that it had. In another example, for treatment-resistant depression, there was a drug that was developed for treatment-resistant depression, and as part of their application package, the applicants submitted a patient preference study. Right. And that really helped, because this drug had side effects of potential dissociation. It meant that people following the administration of the drug couldn't drive for a certain period of time, right, and things like that, where there was a relatively significant kind of risk profile to the drug that was going to impact people. And so the patient preference study really did clearly kind of outline what patients were willing to accept, and then it also outlined what patients were unwilling to accept as far as benefits and risks. And so that certainly did inform the decision. And then there's obviously multiple other examples. For a recent Rett syndrome approval, for example, there was both the endpoints that were being considered were something that we heard very clearly from patients mattered to them, and one of the side effects was a lot of GI symptoms, diarrhea and things like that, and it was clear that due to the unmet need, people were willing to kind of accept this. It was treatable, but people were willing to accept it, even though it was a significant side effect. So all of these things are cited in the reviews as important factors that were considered as part of the review process.
Well, thank you, Robyn. They're great examples. Maria.
Thanks. I'm also going to get to your question, but I think it's an important question also to ask, what do we mean by impact of the patient? Because for us at EMA, we have 6 committees that work on human medicines. Patients sit as full members on 4 of those committees, so the patients are always there. They're always voicing their opinion and bringing a patient perspective. We have patients, as I said, that are consulted all along the process. And so in scientific advice, we've touched on some of these things, the endpoints, the comparator, the population. They bring comments on all of these things. They are one voice that's an important voice, along with the medical and scientific and regulatory voices as well. So if we're saying what is the impact of patients, we don't want patients impacting the outcome of a regulatory decision purely by the fact that they're there, right? We want them to have an equal voice within that, but science and evidence-based medicine has to be the basis of our regulatory decisions. But we don't want to have those discussions without the patients there. So the impact is on multiple levels. It's talking about a disease in front of someone who's living with that condition, talking about what those endpoints are, and then making sure that that perspective is also heard and considered and listened to and then incorporated. So if the patients are there, whether they're at our committee for human medicinal products that evaluates the benefit risk, where we have patients all along, now we're even doing an early consultation with patient organizations, trying to get what are the unmet needs, what are the burdens of the condition, what are the wished for outcomes of a new medicine, to the point where we have patients involved and get all the same information as the experts, the medical and scientific experts, because patients are experts as well, and bringing that perspective. So there's a lot of different levels where there's impact. So yeah, I can give you an example where a company came to a scientific advice meeting and the regulator said, why aren't you using this medicine as a comparator? And the company said, well, patients don't take that medicine. So we'd invited a father, and he then, in the space of a few days a week, did a survey across Europe of all the medicines that the patients were taking, and they were taking that medicine. So the company was then obliged to use that medicine as a comparator. We had another patient organization that evaluated the results of why a particular drug failed, and they realized for the outcome, the endpoint that the company was looking for, they were looking in the wrong age group, so they were never going to see it. So because the patients knew their disease so much better, in this instance, and again, there are very valid, very good scientists, clinicians and regulators, but there's a different perspective, and I think that's what we're talking about here, the value of that perspective and the fact that we shouldn't be going forward without hearing it, it's just not acceptable anymore. So, sorry.
Thank you.
I'll get off my soapbox now.
So I would really love to take questions from the audience. So please, can you have a think? And I'll come to that. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to come to questions from the audience. So we just talked about, Maria, you talked about evidence-based medicine and this being the basis of how we make decisions. And then you also talked about just the example of a survey, which was sort of put out there. So obviously everything that we do in drug development is based on data and evidence. And so, but there seems to be perhaps a mismatch between the type of data that patient organizations are generating or can generate versus what drug developers are looking to collect in their clinical studies, and then ultimately what might be then sort of accepted by regulators as sort of robust evidence to support decision making. So could I just actually start with Elizabeth, talk about some of the types of information or data that patient organizations are collecting? Then Sarah, if you could sort of comment on what you're then collecting, and then to the regulators on how you incorporate those types of data and sort of align the mismatch in terms of the decisions.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is data coming from patients directly are not always a mismatch with for the maybe the example I just mentioned, the upper limb outcome measure. That was a clinical outcome measure, but we also developed a patient-reported outcome measure, your specialty. And now recently we had the two comparing, and it was perfectly fitting. So the patient-reported outcome measure and the clinical measure were exactly fitting. So in that sense, it's not always a difference. It shows also when we are now in the field also, if we are part of the trials at home, an IMI project, how to do trials at home, then it's fantastic that you have these patient-reported outcome measures who do indeed, or who can replace clinical tests. So it's not always a mismatch, but the focus is, I think it's more that the focus is different. And we had a lot of the itching is a famous story also with patients with itching wounds. And I think it becomes more and more relevant to start with so not halfway ask what's relevant to patient, but start with what, I repeat myself a little bit here, but that makes drug development so much easier. And I think what patients want to bring in is their daily life. A good example is that in Duchenne we had the 6-minute walk test, which was a failure anyway, but okay, that was the outcome measure. And then I remember that the first time I was at and I don't break any confidentiality here, I got a question like, but what does it mean if a patient walks 20 meters more in 6 minutes? I said, well, of course, then it slowed down the progression of the disease. I said, that's not what you measured. You measured 20 meters. So then if you go exactly like that into the outcomes, then of course you're not going to pay a lot of money only to walk 20 meters more. Because if you're in school and you have to leave your classroom half a minute earlier or a minute earlier to reach your next classroom, that is not something you go through a whole trajectory of expensive drugs. So I think there is also a mismatch, like how do you translate outcome measures to daily life, and only then you can say what is meaningful. That was, for me, really, I was so embarrassed then that I thought, is this how it works? Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah?
For me, like thinking about the drug development that we are doing, I do think it depends on the patient community as well, because some, like how we collect data. Because for some of the conditions that we are studying, it's just was ultra rare. There was nothing available, nothing developed, nothing. So the information becomes very qualitative that you get. And I think it's hard to concretely measure. So then it becomes more of making sure people are heard. Like ultimately that's what it is about, right? We engage with all of these people across the board, you know, the physicians, the patients, the regulators, to listen and hear the advice and incorporate it, so then it becomes qualitative in a way, versus if you have a disease where there is a lot of information already available. There are registries available, there are things that you can concretely look at from a data perspective and run data analyses on, because the information is available to actually come up with certain outcome measures that may be relevant to drug development. And then there's a whole process associated with if you want to bring something new forward, which we actually did in one of the programs. We developed also a patient-reported outcome, which actually incorporated jaundice as one of the signs of the disease. And because for people, the jaundice is very visible, and so it was very stigmatizing. So to be able to actually remove people's eyes like being yellow, their skin being yellow, was very important for patients. And so by being able to incorporate that in a patient-reported outcome that we then anchored to another scale, to be able to highlight what would be clinically meaningful, we were able to provide some relevant information there.
Yeah, so you've already talked about sort of patient-reported outcomes. There's sort of qualitative sort of survey-type data, then there's registry data. Could you, just from a regulatory perspective, can you just comment on how you incorporate those different types of data? And then I'm going to come to the audience. Maybe I could have a microphone here as well, a handheld, please.
So sure. I think what's really key is this concept of what's fit for purpose, right? And so we are all data-driven, but there's that early data, maybe like a patient-focused drug development meeting, where that's giving us kind of a sign, right, of what might be some good endpoints, what might be some good targets for therapies, et cetera, that can really be built upon with kind of that more rigorous data collection. Obviously, hopefully you all are aware, we have a series of 4 patient-focused drug development guidances, and all of them are about 50 pages each. So, so we talk a lot about that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of, as Sarah mentioned, there's a lot of patient groups that are in different phases of their ability to collect data, whether that's in conjunction or on their own. I mean, the recent Friedreich's ataxia approval leveraged a natural history study that was done by a patient group. And so there is a lot of really good data out there. I would encourage people, I'm going to get on my soapbox very briefly and encourage people to share as much data as possible, especially in the rare disease area where patients are few, and we really need to leverage that to the extent we can so that people aren't getting the same questions over and over and over again. But I think, to your point, there's all different sorts of data, and they can be incorporated in multiple different ways.
Thank you, Robyn. Maria?
I have to agree with Robyn, and as I was preparing my answer, I was thinking exactly of the guidances made by FDA, and EMA has not made a guidance, but we are releasing a reflection paper on patient experience data probably just after summer for consultation. And I think it's the sort of thing that we've been doing for many years, collecting patient experience and bringing that into regulatory decisions. And it's exactly the kind of thing that it's got to be fit for purpose. The data that comes, whether it's an individual coming and speaking to a committee or to an advisory group and bringing their personal experience, or whether it's data that's collected by a patient organization that's submitted, it's considered, and it's got to be fit for purpose. So I think it's the kind of thing that we are also still learning how best to use it. And we're kind of counting on the public consultation for more input as well. And I think that's important. It's very much a community thing.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Trevor first of all. If you could give your name, where you're from, and direct your question to the panel.
Thanks. I'm Trevor Jones. I certainly learnt my experience about not involving patients when I was developing AZT, the first drug for HIV. And you know what? They wouldn't comply with my protocol. They put all their tablets into a pot and shared them. I mean, completely confused the clinical results. But my question to you is this. In my more recent times with the Audis and NORD in America with rare diseases, some of the people who are advocates are very much their own persons. They don't really represent the bulk of patients out there. They represent their particular cause. So how do you actually distinguish between that rather more limited approach and get a really good patient cohort to get the information you require?
Who do you want to direct that to? Okay. Who would like to take it then? Oh, you've got three.
I got the mic, yeah. No. Well, what is clear, that is something you should avoid absolutely. And that is why in your order started this, but more diseases are having now a community advisory board, which are really people from 12, in our case, it's 12 people from different countries, different background, younger children, older children. They are very well trained, and your orders provide, we are trainers on that, provide trainings for patients, that they really have a group and not this single. The same, by the way, is true, and I said that before. We are not in favor of patient advisory board handpicked by companies, because that is not, you need a neutral place, a neutral group, independent of industry, because otherwise you see that patients are flown in and whatever, and they are made very important, and they say whatever is convenient for the company. I say it a little bit black and white, but these community advisory boards are really the way forward. Yeah.
No, it's just.
Sorry, no. And at EMA, it's also not one person. You also collect, as I said, the data. We collect data. If we get, for example, the question about the biopsy that was asked 10 times to me, I thought I have to do something to make sure that I really can speak on behalf of a large group. So we collect data on that. Yeah.
So my perspective on this, I think there is a room for both. in a way, and it also depends on the disease. And we actually spoke about this because some of the ultra-rare diseases, there is really very few patients, and then within the very few patients, there is only few that actually feel comfortable really engaging. So I think there is definitely that aspect of it. The way we realize that, right? Everybody that we get input from comes with a certain angle, including us, like including everybody here, right? But it's trying to talk to as many people as possible, plus also leveraging whatever is already available. So you brought up the sickle cell disease report. We read that from beginning to end back. We leverage all of the different types of information. But to me, a patient advisory board comes with the same bias as a physician advisory board, right? Like the advice you get is indeed representative of the people on that panel. And so what we're then also trying to do is, because we're doing global trials, what may be true in the US may not be true in France, may not be true in the Middle East. So you need to try to get all of those perspectives, but ultimately it's about merging it all and trying to do just your best. Put your foot down at some point, because otherwise we can't move forward.
Maria, you had a comment on this?
Yes, I just wanted to compliment. So just full disclosure, I did work for Eurodis before joining the Medicines Agency. And so I think an important part is also training. Some people are always going to come to a regulatory meeting and bring their own perspective and possibly be quite emotional about it and request that the drug is authorized at all costs. And you can't, in a way, you can't really avoid that. So the thing I think that's important is training. We have meetings with the patients before they join the regulatory meeting to explain what's required of them, try to bring a bigger perspective than just your own, but also the personal story is also quite important. So I think it's an interesting question you raise, and it's hard because we can't bring an entire advisory board into a regulatory meeting. You can't have 12 people, 12 patients, and only 3 regulators, for example. So it's always a balance, I think, with these things. But I do think that training and information and letting people know where they are in the process, what their role is, what's expected of them, it's an important part to play.
Thank you, Maria. I know there's a few questions. Munir.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. You may know that the 4th of July is not just American Independence Day, but also we have the UK general election this year. So we are in a pre-election period. So unfortunately, the UK regulator can't be here today. June Rain was supposed to be here. But I do a lot of work with the UK regulator, and what you're saying very much accords with what the UK regulator is doing in terms of patient and public involvement and engagement in terms of decision making. So when I'm sort of working with the MHRA, I always ask about underserved populations. And I don't only mean ethnic minorities, I also mean, for example, the elderly. You know, when drugs are being tested, they may be tested in the younger population, and then they're given to elderly populations, etc. So how do the regulators of industry really take into account the views of the underserved populations?
Can I start with Robyn on this? Because I know FDA is doing quite a lot of work on this, and new guidance is...
Sure. So first, the first guidance in the patient-focused drug development series really talks about representativeness and ensuring that you get that representative sampling and views. And of course, we also will soon be rolling out a diversity guidance on the importance of diversity planning when you're planning clinical trials, with the goal of really having people think about this question early, right? Because I think one of the big challenges with patient-focused drug development, with diversity and representativeness, is that sometimes it comes as an afterthought. And when it's an afterthought, it's really hard to kind of catch up. It's really hard to be, you know, in the last 10% of your recruitment and realize that you have nothing but white men enrolled and go, oh shoot, we need to change that. It really needs to be kind of built from the ground up and really, really thought about. And it's something that we're looking at. It's something that I know people are really starting to think about more and more. But it's hard, right? Because you need to, in a lot of ways, you need to be thinking of building relationships. You can't just kind of helicopter in, ask people what they want, and then helicopter out, never to be seen again. There's an aspect of trust, there's an aspect of transparency, and things like that. So it's, and you know, to your comment about the elderly population and such, you know, we're talking a lot about decentralized clinical trials and having people do virtual clinical trials and making this easier. And I just attended a seminar from some researchers, I think they were at Stanford, that really talked to the elderly, like an elderly population. The elderly population was like, we do not want virtual trials. Like this is something that, I mean, and obviously this is a very heterogeneous population, right? So obviously there are some people that do want them, but I think it's really hearing from people what's going to allow them to be successful and planning for it in the beginning. And as my last word, I will just say that, you know, one of the things that I thought was really fun on our prep call was when we started talking about metrics and the idea of this like first patient into the trial being like such an important metric. And it's my least favorite metric, right? Because it doesn't really matter how fast you can get the first patient in if it's going to take you 5 years to get the last patient in. So it's really worth that upfront work to kind of make sure that you're getting it as right as you can in the beginning before kind of rushing into starting. So.
Totally agree. Totally agree. A couple of things. I think to pick up on the last point, indeed, patient engagement and the logistical part of trial development cannot be underestimated, because if you put in a ton of barriers, you actually will not be able to enroll the trial. And specifically in rare disease, I think it's already hard, right? And so putting in extra barriers is just impossible. And I think from my perspective, we spoke about this, I don't have a perfect metric to tell you how much we gained by having patients involved in our clinical trial development. I can only say like we have been enrolling our trials on time or delivering earlier than anticipated. So from my perspective, it seems to be going well, although I don't have like a direct correlation. I think there are things, like practical things that really are important, like the pills. You just mentioned it from an elderly perspective. We had a similar example on the younger perspective, because 12 and up, we thought pills were going to be fine, and all of the mothers were like, well, they have to take already so many pills, like microgranules, even when a child is 12, 13, 14, that you can mix in, might actually provide, it may make it easier for certain pediatric patients to participate. So we decided to actually try to accommodate that in the clinical trial based on that feedback. And then in regards to clinical trials, they should try to be as representative as possible of the patient population you're trying to serve. So your inclusion and exclusion criteria, for instance, we don't put an age cap on our participation. To try to actually have a patient population that is older participating in our clinical trials. That being said, we also do want clinical trial participants that are able to complete the trial, because if you have huge dropout for whatever reason, because you basically allow everybody to participate, then you are not delivering again on the data at the end and are not serving anyone involved in the disease. So it's always this sort of balancing act between all of these different things and trying to just
but being
do the
purposeful
best.
In your inclusion-exclusion criteria.
Exactly, purposeful and trying to do the best you can.
We have a question over here.
And I'm the Global Head of Plain Language Services at Syneos Health. It was very interesting to hear all this discussion about involving the patients early on to develop endpoints that are fit for purpose for them. One thing in my experience, and I've been working in this area of plain language for about 5 years now, is that if it's not required by the regulators, the sponsors won't do. So luckily, with the EMA, lay summaries are now a requirement, and that's the bulk of the work that we do. But one question I think particularly for Dr. Sarah that I would like to know is, when is not a requirement, the biggest two limitations I see is budget and timelines. How did you overcome that, and any lessons learned, please? Thank you.
Yeah, there is always constraints on budget and timelines, always, right? But I think because of the language angle, I think, well, clearly I have an accent, right? So I am sensitive to different languages. And I think in our company, because the patient populations we're trying to serve are truly global, but even within the US as well, they're speaking multiple languages. So we're trying to make sure that our workforce actually is able to speak different languages as well, to be able to connect. Because language is something that binds people together. And this is fitting again with our fueled by connections theme that we have at the company. So we're trying to be mindful of that. We do also provide information in the key languages that are going to be in our clinical trials. So for instance, for one of our trials, and I'm sorry, I always mispronounce, Arabic, we have information available beyond English in multiple language for some of our clinical trials where it is relevant. We are not, of course, to your point, there is always budget and limitations. We are not going to go be able to provide information in every single language that is participating in our clinical trial, because it becomes way too complex, and also from a review perspective it becomes too complex because everything on the clinical trial side also gets reviewed. So there are limitations there.
Talking of limitations, we do have some time limitations. I have a number of other questions to get through. So Dave, and then we'll go here, and then I think over here. So hope we'll get through as many as we can.
I'll make this quick. Dave Miller from Genesis Research. So, one of the issues in drug development is when a product gets indicated for a disease population, that's where the payers start, right? And this has a big patient impact, essentially, because the payers will start there and then start the subgroup below, wherever they can find the highest value. So I guess I'm looking at Sarah, my former Biogen colleague. What conversations go on in drug development design around that problem?
So that's a tough one too, because we do know that indeed, like that feel and longer term impact on how patients can function once they take a drug is very important. So we try to leverage as much data as we can across the board. This is also part why open label extensions and continued following of patients is helpful. But we also try to think about this angle when we start drug development. So we have our health economics and outcome research partners in phase 2 contribute to the whole of drug development. So another stakeholder that gets brought in, and we try as much as possible to hit on the endpoints needed there as well, with certain caveats, right? Because every stakeholder has different assessments of risk in the context of drug development. So for instance, this came up in one of our pediatric development programs, in which we know at some point a placebo group will be very tough to do. I think from a regulatory perspective, that will be possible to have a clinical trial without placebo group. However, from a payer perspective at that point, the data becomes less clear in the assessment, and that is a risk that we'll just have at some point have to take and come up with different ways to provide information that is needed.
I think there's a whole panel on sort of HTA and payer requirements.
Could I?
Yes, Maria, and then we've got a question from here.
Just very quickly, with EMA under the previous European network with for health technology assessment bodies, there used to be a lot of scientific advice that was joint between the HTA and the EMA, and now next year under the HTA regulation, we're going to see that hopefully augment again. So I think as companies, it's important to request joint advice, and I think that's where you can get the regulators and the payers, or at least the health technology assessment, speaking to each other with you, and hopefully save you some time there as well.
That's true. Thank you.
Thank you. James Easterbrook from Morehouse. Elizabeth, it sort of builds on your point about your son's engineering education. If someone came from another industry and they saw that there was a specific group doing patient-focused, or a specific leadership doing patient-focused drug development, rather than that just being the way, they would find that quite weird. And I think it speaks to your point around the kind of way of design thinking. Why is that the case? Why is this so far behind, and what changes it?
Yes, that's something I ask myself quite often, like why this is happening, and why it's also so difficult if you speak about it. People will say, oh yeah, really, but that is not drugs, you know? I think the drug field maybe feels a bit special, like we know what we do, we know, I don't know why they won't get moving, but I think at the end, and I mentioned that to you, it's still from bench to bed, but we should go from bed to bench and then back to bed again. And that is still something which did not sink in. Maybe we should create an award for that, you know? Maybe that's an incentive. I don't know, there's lacking an incentive, I think. It's still too often that people say, yeah, we have, companies, they have a nice molecule and then they look for a disease that fits their molecule, right? So that is, and that's still ongoing, yeah. Maybe it's nice if anybody has an idea to change this, yeah.
We had a bit of a discussion about what's the gold standard and actually realised that there wasn't one. But you know, sometimes pharma kind of creates a department to do something that they need to do before it then becomes integrated in everything that you do. I have another question here.
Hello, my name's Zoe Barker. I run the Patient Connect unit at Clarivate Analytics. So we deliver messages to address compliance challenges, and then we measure impact using patient longitudinal data. In a context where 50% of patients stop taking lifelong drugs within 6 months, what can the FDA and EMA do ahead of launch of drugs?
Question. Who would like to take that? Robyn first.
I mean, that's a great question. I think that it's one of the things that we're hoping patient-focused drug development will help to address, which is to, if a drug is developed to meet the needs of patients and is helpful to them, I think that at least from a regulatory perspective, then they have the ability to, they will want to keep taking the medicine. Now, access to the medicine, whether that's through payers or things, is a little outside of the scope of the FDA, but at least trying to ensure that the medicines that are developed and approved are meeting the needs of the patients and are there for access is at least kind of a first step.
But even the measures to sort of measure whether patients are staying on treatment is sort of substandard, aren't they, really? Because you're not, often if you measure blood levels, actually you see there's much less patients taking the drug in the trials than you think is taking from sort of patient surveys.
I think adherence is a very complex thing. As perhaps one of the least adherent patients on the planet myself, like even I'm not really clear, I have access to all of my medicines, but I'm not really clear on why I just kind of stopped taking them. So I think it's a complicated factor that some of it is economic, some of it is a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. We are currently working in BEAMER, which is an IMI project on adherence, and look very much into personas. You know, it's why it's and we don't have the final data, so I can't say anything about that. But if you see the different personas, people with different characteristics, adhere in a very different way, that at the end is something you should include in as companies, and maybe for regulators might be a little bit difficult more than, but that could be, that's the next, I think that's a new era where we really are now looking into. Yeah.
I also think it depends on the medication and what it's supposed to treat, to be honest, because like thinking of examples, if you really feel bad and then you take a medicine that makes you feel really better, like for instance the fatigue component, that medicine is doing other things that are, beneficial in the context of your disease, but you may not feel outcome of that. Like for instance, if you treat hemolysis, there may be some long-term benefit, but you don't necessarily would feel that based on the lab parameters. Versus if you feel actually less fatigued, there is an immediate reason to continue to take a medication. It's like your cholesterol pills. When you take them, you don't really feel anything. You're kind of trying to invest in your future self, and it's harder to, this is kind of why I think people have a hard time sometimes to stop smoking, because it's far out, the consequence. So I'm not sure if each medicine can be looked at from the same angle per se. right? And so for what we're trying to do, and it's not ideal at all, because clinical trial participants, per definition, are clinical trial participants and are very committed to coming in and doing all what they need to do. But we try to incorporate that as much as possible, like a maintenance of effect assessment within our clinical endpoints, to be able to highlight that it's not just a one-off measurement, but something that can be measured over a longer stretch of time, which I think is important in the context of chronic disease and helpful for payers too. But yeah, I think it's disease by disease and medicine by medicine, probably.
Well,
you know, and then again, every disease is different, because we for one of the diseases, compliance is considered a big issue, which we actually have not observed in our clinical trial as being an issue. But when we spoke to people about that and trying to put in extra measures to make sure that people actually were taking the medicine, they were very much against that, because they did not want to be, treated as children, and so we decided not to do that, and it's all turning out well, but could have gone differently potentially.
Well, I'm afraid we're up to time, but I'd just like to just have a closing remark from each of you, maybe starting with Maria. If you took an aspirational view of the next 3 to 5 years, and you think about what you'd really love to see in sort of patient engagement or patient voice in drug development, what would that sort of one thing that you'd like to see be? And is there any ask that you have as life sciences audiences, or any ask that you have for life sciences and what you'd like to see more of from them?
Yeah, thank you. So 3 to 5 years is actually not a lot of time, right? It's kind of next week in reality. So I think more of the same. I've noticed since my time starting in the patient organization in 2008 to now, really such a big adoption of the importance of the patient voice all throughout medicines development, regulatory, and now the last frontier kind of health technology assessment and payers. So more of that, more kind of recognition of like the theme for this, which was nothing about them without them. So just keep going. I think we're in the right direction, and I think just keep accelerating that. As a regulator, I would say please utilize all of the tools that the regulators offer, pre-meetings, early discussion, any kind of advice that you can get from the regulators in order to save yourself time and money as developers. And I think that's really where we're here for that. So please utilize the services, the tools that are available.
Thank you, Maria. Elizabeth?
Yes, well, I would say one of the things we as the European, let's say, patient organizations would like to see is that there is a clear pathway for data collected by patients and patient organizations to be put into the regulatory process. Because it's not part of the clinical trial. Of course, there are also things, but outside the clinical trial. And they are also not always published, you know? So what is the status of these data? Everybody says it's very important. Everywhere is patients are central, I mean, you know. But then at the end, if we really know something, and we see something, we collect the data, like we have a data platform for patients where they can bring all the data together, where we also collect data where, for example, Duchenne is not only muscle, it's also brain, but nobody looks at the brain. But for daily life, for most families where the children, and that's about a quarter of the children, really have such daily problems with their learning, behavior, whatever, that is a much larger problem than the muscle. Nobody's collecting that, not in clinical trials, not in registries by clinicians. So, for example, we have these data, but how do we get them in? What is the door, we call it, and what is the door where we can bring these in? In the real-world evidence, there's no programs as they are currently ongoing. There's no place for that because these are huge. I'm also the advisor in the advisory board of Darwin. That's the real-world evidence project from the EMA, and there you see that is about huge databases. That's fantastic, but that's not what we as patients collect. So a pathway there would be fantastic. And I also think that the line between what companies and clinicians both should not start thinking for patients. We said that before. There was a nice paper on poverty this week, that people who have never lived in poverty make programs for people in poverty, how to get out of poverty. You don't know, you know. So that is kind of my message, I think, for today.
Thank you. Sarah?
I think from an industry perspective, for the drug developers in industry, we don't assume knowledge, medical knowledge. We use advisors, physician advisors. It should be the same during the drug development process because the patients ultimately have the experience and are living with it. So you can't do drug development without incorporating their perspective. So that to me has to be the gold standard. I also think it has to be, for that to happen, your patient advocacy organization has to sit outside of the communication function, but has to sit in part of the organization that is very well connected to all parts of the business. So they are actually on the forefront of everybody's mind when drug development conversations are ongoing. And so I think that is a key to facilitate that when you are in a company. I do think the structure of your organization matters.
Thank you. Robyn?
So I don't have a lot to add to what my three fellow panelists have already said, except I think that just thinking about patient engagement and early and building it into the system so that it just automatically happens and isn't added in as an afterthought would be really, I think, ideal and the best way of potentially being successful. But when I took this job, I said to the person who was hiring me, so what happens when patient-focused drug development goes away? Because it, like you said, it doesn't feel like it should need to exist. It should just be like a critical part of of the infrastructure. And they were like, ha ha ha, it's never going to go away. But I think that that's it, right? Like I think that it should stop being its special thing and just be core to drug development.
Yeah, what we do.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I want to say thank you so much to the panel for joining us today and for such a lively and interesting discussion. Thank you for the questions from the audience. Please give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you.